Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Alpine Intel's Savvy Adjuster podcast, where we discover the property loss topics important to adjusters with the experts that know them best. I'm your host, Chris Nichols. Now, not only am I your host for today, but I'm also a senior account manager here on Alpine Intel's sales team and have been with the company since March of 2023. So just a bit about Alpine Intel and what you can expect from this podcast before we jump into today's topic, which is wind damage to asphalt shingles. So Alpine Intel is an industry leader in property assessment. We are dedicated to innovation across a broad range of property insurance intelligence. And through our operating brands, which are HVACI, StrikeCheck, and Donut Engineering, we're respected as the industry leader for not only our scale, but our track record of conducting expert, specialized, and accurate investigations. With HVACI, we provide the leading HVAC and refrigeration system assessments and desktop pricing reviews, not only for residential, but commercial claims nationwide. With StrikeCheck, we deliver comprehensive solutions for claims with electronics and other specialty electrical items through accurate on-site assessments. We can also do desktop pricing reviews, and we also offer lightning verification reports. And finally, Donut Engineering leverages the latest and best in technology and decades of experience to provide scientific insight into property losses with perils including wind, lightning, hail, flood, water, and so much more. We're always seeking new ways to help insurance professionals who are looking to learn a little more about the items involved in claims that you're settling. You don't have to be an expert, but who doesn't feel a little bit more confident armed with a bit of knowledge, right? So to that end, we also have a robust adjuster resources page, which you can find linked in the show notes, as well as monthly webinars. And don't forget to sign up for our Savvy Adjuster newsletter. So this podcast is an opportunity for adjusters to hear our very knowledgeable experts chat, compare notes, and share key points about a variety of property topics. Some of you listening might be familiar with us if you've ever submitted a claim assignment to us before, or maybe this podcast is your introduction to Alpine Intel. Either way, we're excited to share this episode with you. Now, as I mentioned, today's episode is focused on a topic we get a lot of requests for, which is wind damage to asphalt shingles. So just a quick disclaimer, we're going to be talking today in general engineering and insurance terms. Obviously, each property loss comes with its own set of circumstances, which is why it's so important to get an on-site assessment to make sure you have the facts for your claims. Now, let's meet our guests today, Gary Ellis and Kevin Hulsman. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
So, Gary, let's start with you. Tell me a little bit about your background and your experience with wind damage and roofing materials.
Well, so I've been an engineer for been working in the engineering industry for over 20 years. Been with Donan. This coming March will be 10 years with Donan. That's when I really got immersed into wind and roof claims and forensic engineering. Beyond that, I just have experience doing construction work and some hands-on experience doing roofing myself. So yeah, and just to continue with my background, I'm in the upstate New York area. I was the first Syracuse employee for Donut.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. And Kevin, I know you know a lot about this topic, both from your position on Alpine Intel's education team, but you have a pretty vast insurance background as well.
Yeah, Chris, prior to joining Alpine, almost a year now, I was a general contractor for a big box retailer for about 10 years throughout college and afterwards. So we sold and contracted most exterior categories, and roofing was our biggest and busiest one. So dealt with a lot of the major manufacturers, several subs, guys doing the work, different styles, different systems. And when I left construction, I joined a major carrier on their catastrophe team. So I chased the weather around the country for 5 years for those guys. And most of the stuff that a catastrophe adjuster looks at is going to be wind and hail related. So we did, wind damage from coast to coast, essentially. And actually, we were just chatting about this beforehand. My last tour, if you will, for catastrophe duty was for Hurricane Ian down in Florida. So plenty of roofs got dinged up pretty good during that storm.
Excellent. So it definitely sounds like both of you are experts in this field. So, and we're happy to have you here. Thank you again for taking your time today and joining us. And I tell you what, let's jump in. So, Gary, I'll start with you. The first question, it may seem like a pretty broad one, but it's a pretty important one. So what actually qualifies as wind damage?
So we're talking mostly residential roofs, right? And asphalt shingles. That's what I'm going to focus on, I think, in this answer. So with that, we're talking about dimensional shingles and 3-tabs on the majority of roofs. And with 3-tab shingles, wind damage comes in the form of the tabs themselves bending and breaking, typically in a horizontal tear or fracture where they overlap, where the next shingle overlaps it. They kind of hinge there if they're unsealed, and that's where they bend and break. In more significant windstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever more significant events, they can come off in groups. Sealed shingles can come off and tear. And that's what you see more prevalently with dimensional shingles, is they'll come off in groups because they're stronger. What I call dimensional shingles, our listeners may call architectural or laminate shingles. They're a little more stiff because they have an extra layer, basically. So when they tend to lift with wind, again, they may come off in groups. I think that's the basics of what we call wind damage, is those mechanisms.
So you said something interesting at the beginning, focusing on residential. So my frame of reference for shingles is just looking around my neighborhood. I can see my neighbor's house, and he has shingles on his house. I have shingles on my house. But is there a certain percentage of, or not percentage, but do you see shingles more in residential applications versus, say, a commercial building, a hospital, or a strip mall, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the asphalt shingles make up the lion's share of residential roofs. I used to know a number. Kevin may know that number. It's been a while since I've done those client-facing roofing basics webinars.
Yeah, I think 4 out of 5 homes in the U.S. market are now going to be asphalt shingles, asphalt product shingles. There's a metric out there that says something like 16 billion square feet are shipped annually, which is pretty insane. I mean, the average house probably is going to be in that like high 20s, low 30s square size. Squares are 100 square feet. So when we're talking about 25 squares or 35 squares, that's 2,500 square feet or 3,500 square feet. 16 billion square feet. So it's an insane amount of material that's out there, and they get put on every single day. So like the age of the shingle and the market is wildly variable. We can have brand new roofs, and then I've seen asphalt shingled roofs that I think the oldest one that I've looked at was probably 50 or 60 years with some of those T-lock shingles in the Midwest. We still have some of those here in New England. I'm here in Connecticut, obviously Alpine's out of Charlotte, but on the CAT team, we looked at roofs all over the place, and 4 out of 5 of them, 80% is going to be asphalt shingles for residential.
And what was that number again? 16 billion?
Billion square feet, yes, and that's every single year. And anybody who's in the insurance industry, knows that a lot of that, probably the majority of that's going to be storm driven. As a contractor, we were doing, more more older roof replacement prior to a storm, or just scheduled upgrades type thing. And then, in the insurance market, it's all reactive. Storm came through, tore off a whole bunch of tabs or whole sections of architectural shingles, and now we got to replace parts or all the roof.
With that number, it makes me want to get into the shingle business. I would imagine it's pretty lucrative.
Well, then you obviously haven't climbed a ladder with shingles. Tell me how you feel after you do that. It sounds like Gary's got some experience with that. Like roofing, probably one of the hardest things I've most grueling things I've ever done. Adjusting roofs, not even putting the roofs on it. Gary, I'm sure you've been on some ridiculously hot and sketchy roofs as an engineer. The closest I think I've ever come to heat stroke was asphalt on an asphalt roof in San Antonio in June. Like it's 105 outside, which means it's like 120 degrees, 130 degrees on the roof. So yeah, it's a great business to be in, but it takes a special kind of person to stick with it. So
You've talked me out of it, Kevin, at
yeah.
this point. So,
Yeah.
well, Gary mentioned something, and I'm going to kind of flip to Kevin on this question. But as far as shingles lifting, I had this, it kind of popped in my head, this question of why do shingles lift kind of at the corner while the remainder stay sealed, Kevin?
There's probably a bunch of things that are going to come into this conversation. What I'll probably start with is the age and condition of the shingle. When a roof first goes on, the shingles typically don't lay nice and flat unless it's really, really hot out. Up here in New England or in the north, if you put a roof on like this late in the season, the shingles aren't going to sit flat. They're going to look curled or maybe bumpy. That might be a scenario where that is. Particularly an older roof, usually the first place that you see a wear and tear where like the seal fails is right at the edges, because that takes all of the weathering essentially. So that's where the sealant's going to let go first. The other thing too is that Mother Nature and UV does a number on shingles, especially on the southern and southwest facing slopes and elevations on a house. So you're going to typically see that more so on those weatherward sides of the house. Like I said, the lifted corners, those are probably the two main things, whether it's a brand new or super, super old roof. I'm not sure how in the weeds we want to get into as far as, inspection techniques and people trying to lift up shingles to manipulate them either on a repair or during an inspection. But those probably the major things is going to be the wear and tear aspect of it. Gary, you probably got a more technical explanation than that, but I might defer to you on that one.
Well, there's one of our sources we cite in our reports. There was a University of Florida study where they looked at a handful of roofs at random, different ages, and overall, they said 70% of the roofs they look at had patterns of unsealed shingles. And then beyond that, they also came down to a direct correlation between those unsealed patterns and age. So basically, the older the shingle gets, the more likely they are to become unsealed. And then on top of that, there were installation method issues. So if they were installed in the vertical racking method, you would see slope-wise straight lines of unsealed corners of shingles, those types of things. But it mostly comes down to whether, well, I'll list off the things that I usually cite. One is warehousing. It starts with the shingle that you put on. If it was kept in a warehouse for too long, and the sealant strips may never have had a chance to adhere when they're put on the roof, they may fail immediately. Kevin mentioned putting on a roof in the Northeast in November. They're probably not going to have a chance to heat up enough to seal properly through the winter, and then they sit on the roof all winter long and not adequately sealed. And then by the time it warms up enough to heat those sealant strips up, they've been on the roof so long they're just not going to activate. Then again, age-related deterioration. I mean, we can talk about wind warranties on shingles. I think that kind of says it all as far as what the manufacturers expect to happen with their seal strips. And Kevin has had a closer hand at that manufacturer link, so he can probably speak more to those.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to point out when it comes to wind warranties is that they are totally separate from the other manufacturer warranties. So the manufacturer warranty will get into like it'll say, hey, this is what when you buy a shingle, you say, I'm going to get a 30-year shingle, I'm going to get a 50-year shingle or a lifetime shingle. Like that's part of it. That's the manufacturer's warranty, and then the wind warranty is usually like a subtitle or a subheader of the actual warranty. So if it's a 30-year shingle or like a 25-year 3-tab, that wind warranty is probably only going to be 3 to 5 years, and which is dramatically different than the rest of that shingle. But the manufacturer's kind of tipping their cap there and saying, hey, if nothing happens to this roof, it's going to be fine. But if you get wind, maybe 3 to 5 years, we're willing to stick our neck out for it. Some of the laminated architectural dimensional shingles, those are going to be that like 30, 50-year limited lifetime type thing. You might see wind warranties from the major manufacturers, the big three, if you will. I don't want to name anybody specifically, but that's probably 10 to 15 years on a wind warranty. But again, it's not the same thing as the manufacturer's warranty, that 25, 30, 50 lifetime thing.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, just as an end consumer with and being a roof owner myself, how long shingles are supposed to last. But it sounds like it really, it comes at that upfront, 25, 30, year. You kind of know the lifetime or roughly when you'll probably have to replace those based off of, what they're rated as.
Yeah, and it's going to depend a lot. There's so many variables that go into how long a shingle is going to last. A shingle that's installed in San Antonio, Texas, we just mentioned that, they could be like the same make, model, manufacturer as the same shingles you can buy up in like Portland, Maine, but those shingles are not going to age or deteriorate remotely the same. San Antonio's weather and climate is so much more hot, so much more heat involved in that versus Maine. But with Maine, maybe you run into things where you've got snow and ice loads on the roof, and you've got roof rakes and a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So it really, really depends. And even more granular than that, like even the same sides of the house, your own house, are going to weather differently. I've seen roofs, one side faces due south and the other side faces due north. And when you're up there, they were installed at the same time, but they don't look anything alike because of heat and weathering. One side, the granulars are falling off of it, like you don't even want to walk on it. It's that scary. And the other side looks almost brand new. And so it really just depends on. So it really depends on a lot of things, to be honest with you. There's just a ton of variables when it comes to that.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. That's pretty interesting. You have to factor in where you are in the country as well,
Mm-hmm.
and what the weather is typically like. I'm in Wisconsin. I have snow on my roof right now. So to your snow point,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that can certainly affect mine a little bit more than somebody in Texas per se. So Gary, another question for you, and this is kind of a technical question I want to ask because I'm kind of curious about it. Is there a specific wind speed and duration that shingles should, withstand wind before they start showing actual damage?
That's a loaded question. I mean, when the shingles go on new, they should meet a certain criteria from the manufacturer. Your building codes through most of the country is 90 mile per hour, wind speeds up to over 100 miles per hour in some coastal areas. And, after 5 years on the roof, you really can't, it's not a reasonable expectation when you're talking about 70% of those roofs having unsealed shingles. And that's the separator with wind events, to me, is whether the shingles are sealed or not. And when you get 60, 70, 80 mile per hour winds, that's when it separates those roofs. The ones that are well sealed may admit, a neighbor's house with a newer roof with well sealed shingles may fare just fine. But then the house next door with older unsealed shingles, you'll find those patterns. Maybe you'll see the vertical racks or the diagonal racks of where the shingles actually come off. and it goes back to the sealant strips.
And you mentioned vertical racks before, and again, I am a novice in here. Can you explain a little bit what a vertical versus a horizontal rack is as far as shingles?
Yeah, so the manufacturers say don't do it. Or at least most of them do. And the National Roofing Contractors Association, I think they also say don't do this. It's called the vertical racking method. And some roofing contractors may do this to try to save time in installing a roof. And as you start, you start at an eave and work your way up the roof, successive courses, and it goes, horizontally. You install a course, and then you install the next course. Well, you can do that going diagonally up the roof, which is fine. That's the way they need to go on. Well, roofers want to save time, obviously, so they might employ this vertical racking method where they just run one column of shingles straight up, and they're only staggered 4 or 5 inches, whatever the minimum. I think the minimum most manufacturers say, I think 4 or 5 inches. It's somewhere around there. So then they go back down to the eave and come back up the next rack. They have to lift that last corner up to tuck the shingle, the next course up in. So there's a few things that happen. They might miss the nail on the next run, or put that nail in at an angle because they're having to do it under a shingle that they're bending, or they ruin the seal because if you're out on a hot day and putting those shingles down, they might have already started to activate by the time they get back down there. So if they got to pull that corner up and break the seal, then it may not reseal. So
Gotcha.
I hope that's clear. That's
Yeah, so the damage pattern, if it's something like that, is like almost in a dead vertical line, and it's somewhere between 6 inches wide damage path all straight up the roof, or it, depending on the overlap for the manufacturer, might be a foot wide, but you can see it clear as day. Sometimes you can even see it from the ground, just like literally headed straight up the roof.
Okay.
There's another phenomenon called zippering, where they appear to install the shingles correctly, up on diagonals. They just keep going diagonal, up the roof, up the roof, up the roof. And if they miss a step, or the overlap's not correct, or the nailing is not great, you'll get these patterns of damage that go on a diagonal. And a lot of times that's something, usually in my experience, it's usually a nailing issue. Too much, not enough, or they just missed it. And you'll see that pattern streak across the roof. Again, it might be something that you can see from the ground. And then as an investigator, sometimes you got to get up there and look at it. And once you see it in some places, typically what I would do to try to make sure that, hey, is this a weather issue or is this an install issue? Weather's directional. So like, I know that let's just use it easy. If the storm was right to left, I should see more damage on the right side than I should on the left side. But if I'm seeing the same like zippering pattern on the right side, but I'm also seeing it on the left side of the house, then it's might be a system-wide issue and maybe not so much weather related. So it's all stuff that's the super technical part of Gary's job and the adjuster's job, is like looking past the obvious and trying to see if this is a weather related issue.
Sure. Yeah. I like the technical stuff as well. It's really really quite interesting. So Kevin, we'll stay with you. And you may have seen this with your background of handling CAT events and being out in the field doing these on sites. And I'm just kind of curious if you see conditions or have seen conditions that are claimed as wind damage that are often something totally different.
Of course. There you get everything. Usually, the most innocent one is like neighboritis, where the neighbor next door got a roof replaced and said it was windstorm damage, and so now they're out front of their house staring at their roof, thinking that, oh, I see something there that I don't think was there before, and they just got their roof paid for because it was wind damage. then they file a claim and they come out there. So, it could be something as simple or innocent as that. It could be something super technical where the manufacturer had an issue with a batch of shingles, and they all have the same exact damage profile as the next one. And usually, like, you'll see that in batches. So like one diagonal run of shingles will have the same exact damage pattern on it. And if you look at that individual shingle, you're like, yeah, this could be storm damage. But if you look at it as a whole, and put it in with the rest of your investigation, you're like, no, I'm seeing the exact same thing. Usually what I would do is they would show up sometimes as a horizontal streak across the 3-tab shingle, and I would start to see a pattern on the roof. And then I would just stick my tape measure on it essentially and show, hey, there's this exact same line on every one of these claimed damaged shingles, like 1 3/8 inch from the keyway, and you could show a pattern there. And so that's, a warranty or a manufacturer defect type thing. And then unfortunately there is, something where you might have, we'll call it, manufacturer damage or man-made damage, where something was done to that roof to modify it to kind of mirror what wind damage might look like. And there's plenty of indicators of what that might be. You had mentioned like lifted corners before. That's one of the first things that, we see sometimes, especially on like an older, more delicate roof is, and again, we can't speak to intent. Maybe it was just an investigation to see what was going on with how many layers or how it was nailed. But the first thing that happens is usually you start working the corner of a shingle to try to lift it and separate it from the shingle below it. Well, that shingle's so old and it's been baked, for 20 years by direct sunlight, and it just simply snaps off. It just simply breaks off. So, all of those three things, from neighboritis to manufacturing defect issues, all the way to like physical, man-made mechanical type damage. Gary,
Gotcha.
you've probably seen a handful of those as well.
Yeah, and I would add to that installation errors and problems that come to light sometimes years, maybe even a decade or more down the road. If there's nailing errors, again, as those sealant strips fail, then any nailing deficiencies come to light afterwards. It's the two most important things with shingles on the roof is that they be nailed properly and that the sealant strips hold. So that's the nailing again is a big deal. So as the sealant strips fail, then they become susceptible to uplift for one by wind, but another thing is just gravity on a steep roof. And if the sealant strips are failed and they're lacking nails, or the nails are placed too high, or the nails are overdriven, should I explain high nails and overdriven nails? You want to get into that?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm here for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so most residential roofs should be getting 4 nails per shingle when you install it. Now, in high wind zones or 12-12 or steeper, there's certain criteria where you're going to add extra nails. But let's just talk about the typical 4 nails per shingle. If you put the nails in the right place, that means each shingle actually gets held onto the roof by 8 nails, because the nail goes into a zone where they're overlapping, right? If you put the nail too high, you're going to miss the one below it. So then if all the nails are placed too high, then that means every shingle's only getting 4 nails instead of 8. And that can be a big deal. The other thing is overdriving or putting them crooked. If you think about the crews that are putting these roofs on, they're using air guns, air nails. So if you've watched them install or listened to those guns, they go ridiculously fast. And it's just, every 4 nails, pow, 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 pow. It's just crazy fast. And by doing that, some of them are probably going in crooked. That means that crooked nail, the head cuts the edge of the shingle where it's crooked. If they have too much pressure on their nailer, then it puts the nail head too far down into the shingle mat, and it can damage the mat. So then that weakens that hold. So that's what overdriving is. So if you have overdriven nails, high place nails, and the sealant strips fail, I've seen a lot of steep roofs where the shingles just start sliding off the roof. And then, the owner may not realize it until they have a thunderstorm and maybe, 40 or 50 mile per hour winds or some marginal wind that takes a few of those off.
Yeah, and to Gary's point, you'll start to see that in patterns too, where most of the time a roofing crew doesn't have one guy up there doing it. It's like an ant farm on that. So you've got multiple people using one giant air compressor, and you got the greenhorn guy that is taking his time and getting that nail gun nice and straight and just click, 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 click. And then you got the other guy who, you can't even keep up with them. They can't keep shingles fed to him fast enough on the roof. He's putting them on so fast. The other couple things that, come to mind when we talk about this, roofs that have multiple layers of shingles are way more susceptible to wind damage, because usually those, first of all, not really recommended. You can do it. There's a lot of municipalities that will let you do like a re-roof or a shingle over, sometimes they're called, up to 3 layers, which crazy to me, now having been on both sides of the business. And the reason they do it is cheaper. It's just cheaper to like not remove stuff. You don't have to deal with the demolition of the old roof, any trim work or stuff like that might get involved, especially if there's multiple layers. And then you're dealing with putting shingles on. But the key with that is that, first off, like we need to make sure that the stuff that they're putting that new shingle on is in decent shape. If you've got like hidden rotten wood underneath that with the decking or whatnot, those nails aren't going to hold on, even if the pressure is set correctly. The other thing too is you need longer nails. You're going through more material, and that's often missed. So again, it might look good, the depth of the nail might look, correct for that shingle, but it's not getting enough depth in the underlayment of that, the decking of that shingle. So that's going to make that shingle far more susceptible because it's not hanging on to anything. The other thing that just popped in my head too, like I'm sitting in a 200-year-old house in New England, and on this roof they've got old spaced decking because at some point they had like cedar shake on this roof, and so instead of nice OSB or CDX plywood on the roof with H clips and perfectly butted to get together joints, you've got boards that are like spaced, literally spaced. And if you read the manufacturer's spec or the code, they're saying a lot of times if this is anything more than like 3/8 of an inch, I think is a lot of those. If the gaps are more than 3/8 of an inch, you got to like at a minimum replace that section to make sure that you don't miss the nails. If the nails hit in one of those between spaces, it's got nothing to hang on to. And again, it might look good when it goes on the roof, but you're not going to know you have an issue until Mother Nature does her thing and starts taking whole sections of your roof off. So I think if there's a second title to this one, it'd be like variables of wind claims and wind engineering type of thing, because it's just there's so many variables that go into putting a new roof on and then adjusting it as an adjuster, or creating an engineered stamp report for one. All these things have to be taken into account, and depending on the claim, you might want an expert opinion to kind of back you up there.
And Chris, that's why we're here. Yeah, it is to offer that expert opinion at Donan with our engineering services. And this is maybe a question for the both of you because you have vast experience. Obviously Kevin from being on the CAT team at your previous employer, and then Gary with your extensive time here at Donan. But just kind of popped into my head to ask: are most roofing and shingle and wind related claims associated with typically a cat event, or are there a handful that are just kind of normal everyday, claims? I just didn't know. I'm not asking so much for a percentage, it's 80% cat, 20% just everyday stuff, but any sort of kind of anecdotal information you can kind of give on that? We'll start with you, Kevin.
So the adjuster side of me knows that, like, when I was helping out local offices, the majority of the insurance claims coming in are not roofing claims. It's like a leaky toilet flange, or the dishwasher let go, or the ice maker line for their fridge is bad, like tons of water losses. You'll get the occasional roof claim after like a strong summer thunderstorm or something like that. But that's what the cat modeling is based off of, is all these wind related and hail related events, catastrophic weather. That's where a lot of these the roof volume comes from. So I would, if we had to say, I would say the majority of the roofing claims are likely from a cat event. I think I forget which company does cat numbering, but every year there was 60 to 90 named categorized catastrophe events in the country. So I forget what Ian was. I forget what Ian was, but the Texas pipe freeze in Houston, that was cat like 15 and 17 or 17 and 19 for that year. So a lot of those catastrophic storms are going to be for those roofs, those strong winds, hurricanes, tornado events. So I would say, a lot of the roofing business for insurance companies is going to be cat related, cat driven.
You see the same thing, Gary, with your experience. The assignments that you're sent out, for engineering have been tied to some sort of cat event.
Well, for where I am in the Northeast, we see less hail activity, less windstorm stuff, and the roofs are less abused by solar exposure in the north. So Kevin was talking earlier about the difference between a north-facing and a south-facing roof slope. They made organic mat shingles in the 90s up until the early 2000s, and they just didn't perform. Okay, so it was a organic mat instead of fiberglass. And what they found was it would actually take on a little bit of water, and over time, they would just crumble up and fall apart. Well, I mean, they're basically all gone in the South, as far as I know. I think our engineers in the South some of them probably never even seen. They don't know what an organic mat shingle is. But Kevin can probably attest to this. I still see them on houses up here, and they are really notorious for a north slope organic mat shingle might look pretty good. Then on the south slope, it just looks like a disaster.
Almost looks like it caught fire because it like shrivels up, pulls apart and shrinks and whatnot. And then the fact that they're organic. I mean, there was a shed company in like along the East Coast here. I saw a ton of them in Virginia, where like for some reason they just still bought organic shingles, and any wind claim. Virginia is notoriously bad for high winds. I've spent a month there every single year, adjusting wind claims. And these organic shingles, to Gary's point, like one side looks perfect and the other side looks like somebody set it on fire for a few minutes. The type of shingle matters as well.
Yeah. So my point there is that being in the north, I think I've got a little different perspective. Most of my claims over my 10 years with Donan, I've looked at less roofs than some of our guys in the South, right? Just because of the type of insurance claims that come in up here. Not to say I haven't looked at a lot of roofs. I mean, over 10 years and a couple hundred jobs per year. Yeah, I've seen plenty. And when I do cat travel too. So I'm licensed from Maine down to Florida. And when we have major catastrophes, I'll travel to Florida to look at Ian claims, Ida claims, Irma claims, going back to Matthew before. So roof claims with those. I can't put a percentage on cat versus not.
Yeah, I was just curious, and Kind of a final curiosity question, may just be for me, but I think our listeners will find it interesting as well. Gary, this is both for Gary and Kevin, but Gary, we'll start with you. You said 10 years times 100. That's a lot of inspection. Is there any specific engineering inspection that stands out to you as maybe interesting, crazy, out of the norm that you can think of in your 10 years with Donan?
Well, plenty. Probably easier to dip from if I think of roofs, since we're talking roofs here.
Sure.
One interesting, we talked about nailing problems, and since this focus here is wind, I looked at a house that was, I want to say, was 24 years old. It was a very large McMansion of a house. I can't remember how many roof slopes and how many squares were on this roof. But it was a wind claim. And I got there, and there was legitimately a few patches of shingles that were gone, and they had a shutter that had blown off. They had, so there were strong winds in the area. But when I got on this roof, I found every textbook nailing deficiency that you can point out. Crooked nails, missing nails, overdriven nails, and high placed nails all over this roof. And so, it made it really hard for the homeowner to understand. When I left site, I said, yeah, you got some wind damage shingles, but you have widespread damage to this roof just from gravity and the shingles sliding off, dating back to original installation errors. And, I don't blame the guy for questioning me as the owner. He says, why, after 24 years, would this be a problem now? And my response was that it's the ceiling strips. It all comes down to the ceiling strips. They did a terrible job installing his roof, but it held its own for over 20 years because those shingles kind of acted like a membrane when the seals were in place. But as those sealing strips failed, they just started sliding in groups off the roof. And Kevin made a point about the green horn maybe doing it right, and if you guys not. I think on that roof, what I decided was there was one garage roof slope where all the nails looked beautiful and the shingles looked fine. And I think that's where maybe the supervisor went up and said, listen, guys, here's how you do it. And he put the nails into that. Then all the rest of it, the supervisor took off and left them be, and then the rest of it was a circus. But it was an interesting job, just in that over 20 years, and then all this happens all at once. It's kind of crazy.
Sure. Yeah. Kevin, how about yourself, with your in-field, assessments and inspections that you've done over your career? Any stand out to you as more interesting than others?
Well, there's always like a bunch of stories for every like quote unquote tour that you go on. You're like, oh, I'm going to remember this guy forever, or I'll remember that contractor forever, that kind of thing. There's the ones that stand out specifically for wind. There was a neighborhood, that's another thing too. Again, neighboritis, everybody's seeing, like once you see one yard sign in the front yard of somebody else, you can count that all the neighbors around there are going to be calling too. And so I think it was Midlothian, I think was the town name in outside of Richmond, maybe. I could be getting that wrong, but I went there and I knew that I had two claims in the same neighborhood, which is not uncommon because, again, storm intensity is gonna not hit one house potentially in the neighborhood. It's gonna be the whole thing. Well, the other thing too is all those houses were built about the same time, so all the roofs were about the same age. So I get out there and I do the first two inspections. Like I find wind damage to both houses, and it's my favorite day in the world. I get to buy roofs. I'm like Oprah with roofs, just buying everything, which is great. I love paying for stuff because it made my job easy. But the kicker with that was after the second one, I had somebody driving down the street and be like, oh, I see you're from this carrier. Like, I think you're coming to my house next week. And I was like, I don't have anything else in this area. Well, it turns out there was like 10 or 15 claims for this one carrier in that one neighborhood. We're not talking about a lot of houses, maybe like 50 or 60. Like they had roughly 20 to 25% of the homes insured in this neighborhood. And so me and another adjuster just said, hey, anybody with claims in this neighborhood, just send them to us, and we ended up spending almost a week there, adjusting all of those houses in that area and following up with the contractors and whatnot. So I don't think I've ever done that many adjustments in the same neighborhood before to that point. And then the other one that sticks out, are the ones that give you grief or heartburn, and I had one, I don't want to pick on Virginia, but it was Virginia. And I was fortunate enough to have access to a drone. So, not only was I doing, on-roof inspections, but I was using a drone to inspect the stuff that, you couldn't physically get a ladder to. And so, I arrived, did my inspection, the roofer came out, and he was up there after the fact, and unfortunately he was up there damaging the roof. And who's to say if he was doing it on purpose or not, but the man-made damage is a real thing. And fortunately for me and the homeowners, that somebody was witness to it. But that goes on a whole nother rabbit hole of investigation services and Department of Insurance. So I hope it worked out for her. I wasn't part of the backside, but those people are out there, which is why it's important to do a very, very thorough investigation and tie your whole claim together, not just any one piece of evidence to hang your hat on.
Sure. Well, very interesting stuff, guys. And Gary, Kevin, I think I speak for not only myself, but everybody listening today. That was extremely informative information you shared with us today. And thanks again to the both of you for being here with us. And obviously, thanks for everyone for listening. You can actually look for a mini episode recapping some of the most important points we covered here today and exploring 5 indicators of wind damage that aren't on the roof. And don't forget, as always, to subscribe to this podcast as well to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you have any property claims that need assessments, head over to our website, alpineintel.com, to submit an assignment or just to get more details about how our suite of services can bring you the answers you need to feel confident about your settlement decisions. You'll also find additional information and resources in our show notes. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.